This summer of learning, SHRM is offering 20% off HR essentials, including the SHRM learning system and specialty credentials. Whether you're charting a course towards advancement or leading executive strategy, grab your passport for career growth with code SUMMER25. Learn more at shrm.org/summer25. Offer ends September 1st.
Welcome to Honest HR. I'm your host, Nicole Belyna, coming to you from SHRM 25, our annual conference in San Diego. Today, we're diving into a topic that's crucial for every HR professional to stay on top of as immigration policies shift and enforcement ramps up. Navigating updates from the E-Verify system and Form I-9. From ICE audits to virtual document review and evolving work authorization rules, our conversation today is focused on helping you protect your organization, support your employees, and stay ahead of compliance risks. We're joined by John Fay, Director of Product Strategy at Equifax Workforce Solutions, an immigration attorney. John is a leading expert in employment eligibility compliance who's presenting on this topic at SHRM 25. Welcome to Honest HR, John.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So let's get right into it. First, let's start with the basics. What is an I-9 and why is it such a big deal this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Form I-9 is essentially one of those requirements that human resource managers and employers just generally have to keep track of, because what it is you have to complete a Form I-9 for every newly hired employee in the United States. And the idea behind it is essentially you want to make sure that your individuals are authorized to work. So this actually dates back all the way to 1986 when, at the time, President Reagan essentially put in this requirement that said that employers are essentially deputized. You know, congratulations, you now got a job that you probably never wanted, but you have to make sure that you are completing this form and that you are actually reviewing documents to ensure that the individual is not only authorized to work, but they are who they say they are. And really, why this has become, I think, so important this year in particular is we've seen a lot of change in immigration and policy and immigration enforcement. And what employers always have to remember is that the Form I-9 is an immigration form. So it is something that they have to do for immigration requirements. And so we've been seeing a lot of change this year, both in policy and also enforcement. And I think that's just really raising the importance of the form.
Great points. So a lot to keep track of for sure for the
Yes.
average HR person. So when working within the I-9 process, employers will come across the terms virtual I-9, electronic I-9. Explain the difference between the two.
Yeah, we have a lot of interesting terminology. And so virtual is actually something that is called, its official name is the Optional Alternative Procedure for Reviewing Documents. Now, that doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, hence we all call it virtual. But really what it is in 2023, they came up with a policy that said that employers can actually review documents remotely. Previously, and for so many years, the requirement has always been when you're completing the Form I-9, you're obviously seeing documents. You're seeing documents that show both identity and employment authorization. And that process is essentially always an in-person affair. Well, in 2023, it changed, and all of a sudden there's this allowance where you can do it virtually. And so that really has been a game changer for a lot of employers because, obviously post pandemic, we see employers still hiring remotely quite a bit, but we've also seen just employers wanting to streamline their onboarding processes. And so it really just kind of opened things up. So that's virtual. And then electronic I-9s is essentially just the process for completing it. So, the form has always been on paper, but then since 2004, all of a sudden we are able to electronically generate and store and retain those forms. And so that's kind of the difference between the two of those.
Sure. So, just as a reminder for SHRM members, we do offer a toolkit that talks about how to comply with I-9s and E-Verify requirements. So, that link you can find in the additional resources on our website. So, let's talk a little bit about worksite enforcement. How do notice of inspections or NOIs of Form I-9s work, and has anything changed with the process this year?
Yeah. So one of the ways that I always describe the Form I-9 audit or notice of inspection is it's kind of like the ultimate pop quiz. Because as employers, as we've discussed, you're obviously supposed to complete these forms for all newly hired employees. But what's interesting is you don't actually file it anywhere. There was a Stanford law professor that said that the Form I-9 was probably the most completed federal form that's not actually filed with the government agency, right? Instead, we all complete them, or we should complete them, and then we just keep them and we wait for the government to show up. Right. And so the notice of inspection is, hey, we're here. And so essentially it is generally governed by Department of Homeland Security, a specific agency called Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And essentially the way it works is they can audit any employer in the United States. The notice of inspection, or NOI as you called it, is a template form. They will serve it either in person, or actually they can do it by mail. We've even seen it email. That's a little bit different this year. And essentially, what it does is it tells an employer that their Form I-9s are going to be under inspection. And it gives them 3 federal business days to produce those documents, as well as actually a lot of other documents as well. And so it's a really potentially scary time for HR and just employers in general, because you may have been completing them, you may have been doing them well, or you may not have, and then all of a sudden you get this very short window of time to actually turn them over. And then in terms of what's changed this year, we've just seen a whole lot more of them. During the last few years, I would say that the Form I-9 inspections had really gone down a bit. But in kind of connection again with this immigration enforcement, we've seen a lot of notices of inspection really all over the country.
Sure. Do you have any stats and some examples of ICE and HSI audit activity that can demonstrate the consequences of organizations not being ready and compliant?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There are quite a few, and so probably the most notable this year is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, as we refer to them. They've been very active on their newsroom on their website, so it's ice.gov and then newsroom. And so they actually fined 3 employers about a total of $8 million for a variety of I-9 violations. And these were just like 2 of the employers had 100% violations. One was pretty close behind. And they also were allegations of unauthorized employment as well. So, that kind of stat, the $8 million definitely rose some, eyebrows. But then in addition to that, we've seen just a lot in the news. So back in May, we started seeing additional audits really all over the country. There was a lot of worksite enforcement operations that started happening in larger cities. Los Angeles was certainly impacted. We've seen a lot of audits in those areas. In addition, the DC area received over 100 Form I-9 audit inspections, primarily targeting both restaurants and hospitality. So, we've started to see, occasionally see some specialization in terms of what they're looking for in terms of industries. But the other thing is employers always have to remember anybody can be audited, right? All employers have this responsibility.
Sure. Yeah. Definitely a time of heightened awareness for HR professionals to kind of be on their toes. And so, what steps can HR teams take to develop a plan, for worksite enforcement?
Yeah, I think there are a few things. Number one is just being prepared for when the government shows up. So that is really the number one thing that we're seeing employers do right now, is really to have an audit preparedness plan, right? I mean, you want to make sure that your organization, your work site knows what to do when all of a sudden the government shows up. And so part of that really is having a detailed plan where like what your front office individuals or receptionists are doing. You want to make sure that you have like a contact policy, so you know who's going to be contacted first in terms of your inside counsel, outside counsel. Obviously, you want to have procedures and protocols in place in terms of what you say to the government agencies, how you say it. Usually, we'll have some sort of combination of making sure people stay calm and make sure that at the same time that they don't grant more basically access than what the government would be required to. Understanding the different types of documents. The government might show up with a notice of inspection, or they might show up with a judicial warrant, right? I mean, there could be a variety of different things. And so I think having that plan is really step one. And then beyond that, I think it's just, looking at your own I-9s and then trying to assess, okay, well, if the government shows up, how would we fare, right? And if you don't feel like you would fare very well, that's when you would start going through perhaps like an internal audit type of thing.
Sure. Yeah. So I I was just going to say doing an internal audit is likely helpful.
Yeah.
Maybe doing it on a regular basis, but for sure, if you haven't done one in a while,
Yes.
now's the time.
Yes. And what's so interesting is employers, like I would say, or HR in general, are so well aware of this. So for so many years, it would be, the attorneys were going out saying, hey, this is a good idea. Now it's the opposite. We have HR coming to us saying, hey, we're already starting on the audit here. What are some best practices? What should we consider? So it's already in the minds of so many of HR representatives. And I expect it to continue.
Yeah, I bet. We just completed our internal audit not too long ago.
Right.
So,
Hmm.
what about electronic I-9 considerations for this action plan? Do you have any special advice there?
Yeah. So since so many organizations are using electronic I-9s, there has to be some consideration about, okay, what is the government going to ask when you are storing your I-9s in the cloud or you're generating them electronically? And as it turns out, there's a whole other body of regulations that concerns how I-9s can be electronically generated, stored, and produced. And some of those things like audit trails, right, as one of the key components of an electronic I-9, electronic signatures. There's a lot of elements that can be requested by the government if you are using electronic I-9s. Now, I'm not speaking poorly of electronic I-9s because they're actually a great way to help, prevent errors because many of them have error checking. They allow you to go paperless. They allow you to do reporting. They allow you to do a lot of great things, but you just have to make sure that you understand what's required from a regulatory perspective and that you're prepared to turn it over. Like one of the things that we always recommend is like if you're creating this preparedness plan, make sure you have somebody in IT. Like, do you know how you can download the I-9s? Do you have a secure site in terms of where, those I-9s can be provided to the government since they have a lot of PII on them, right?
Sure.
So all of those things, again, just taking that electronic I-9 component and building it into your preparedness plan.
Great. That's a good point. And do you think just an internal audit is okay? Do you recommend that HR professionals reach out to a third party just to be safe?
I
Better safe than
do.
sorry?
I do. There are a lot of very, very knowledgeable HR representatives. They've been doing this for years, but there is something to say for having a third party who can, review those practices and policies because we have seen self audits where they've actually made, the process worse, right? We've seen like many years ago people using whiteout. They're trying to hide mistakes. They're redoing I-9s when they didn't really need to. There are a lot of different elements associated with it. And so using a third party representative can be very helpful. There's also something psychological about if you completed this Form I-9 and then you're auditing it yourself, you may not see that same thing, right? It just helps to have somebody else involved.
That's a great point. And especially too, if there's turnover in your HR department, right? If you inherit a bunch of I-9 documents, I think it's always a good best practice to do those audits when you
Yes.
take over.
That reminds me, by the way, that's the number one question I get every single time I speak at SHRM. Somebody in the audience will raise their hand and say, so I inherited a bunch of I-9s. It always begins the same way. And it's a very common thing. And,
Yeah.
and it's difficult, right? Because all of a sudden you're in this new position. You didn't do this. And now all of a sudden you have to figure out how can I resolve this issue?
Yeah, I'll tell you whenever I take over a new HR team, that's one of the first things that I do.
That's good. Yeah. Understand.
All right. So moving on to immigration policy. So, according to the 2025 SHRM report, the role of foreign born workers in the US labor force, there are more than 32 million foreign born individuals ages 16 and older who are working in the US today. So, that's nearly 20% of the US labor force. So, proper I-9 compliance and workforce enforcement is critical for employers to understand. So, having said all that, what must HR professionals understand about the many paths to work authorization in the US?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to do is to understand just kind of broadly how they can be bucketized, so to speak. So you as an employer may have certain types of immigration related I-9s for your sponsored individuals. So these are individuals where you as an employer are actually filing a petition usually like an H-1B visa, an L-1 visa. There's a whole alphabet soup of them, but essentially you as the employer are involved, and those have some tricky elements to them. But I find that generally employers are pretty good about them. But then there's these other categories where individuals could have essentially a work permit, and you have no idea what the basis of that is, right? It could be, a family-based immigration that they're in this process that gives them the ability to have a work permit. They could be a foreign student who just completed their studies. There could be a variety of things. It could be somebody on humanitarian parole or temporary protected status, which are two of the things that really have changed this year. And so those are just the things I think that employers have to understand. There are many different paths, and making sure that you understand the different rules surrounding them. We often like to say that we joke that the I-9 form has I think, 100 and some page manual for it. And most of that, by the way, is on these foreign national situations.
So, how have recent changes to humanitarian parole and temporary protected status impacted employees working in these programs that allow people to enter or stay in the US temporarily due to urgent humanitarian needs and unsafe conditions in their home countries?
Yeah, and I would say there really has been two things that have impacted employers. So number one is there's just a lot of volatility. So under these programs, humanitarian parole, temporary protected status, the current administration has terminated the humanitarian parole for a group of individuals. They're called CHNV, so it's Cuban, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And the issue with this is, as a lot of things, is there's a lot of litigation around it. And so we've seen litigation kind of back and forth. There's been a time period where all of a sudden this termination was going to go into effect, and then all of a sudden it wasn't going to go into effect. And so as an employer, you're trying to figure out, well, do I have a authorized workforce, and do I need to do anything about it? So there's that volatility on the one side. And then on the other side, you have to make sure that you are keeping up to date, not only with all of these changes, but that you're also thinking about your own workforce planning, right? So depending upon your industry and organization, you might have a lot of individuals who are affected. We've seen some industries, again, such as like hospitality, agriculture. We've seen some in staffing who get very impacted by these sudden immigration changes. So they have to think about, well, all of a sudden, if this happens, what's going to be the impact of my workforce? Am I still going to, am I going to have to hire new people? There's just a lot of different things that HR has to really consider and think about.
All right, so let's talk about examining documentation.
Yeah.
Avoiding discrimination when examining I-9s is a delicate balancing act, for sure. What are some do's and don'ts to ensure the process is fair and unbiased?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to recognize is there's this thing called the list of acceptable documents. And by the way, if you're a fan of acronyms, that would be LOAD. And we think that's appropriate because it is a lot of stuff to remember. And one of the things to do, it's kind of like I-9 101, but again, I've seen mistakes, is that's always kind of what you have to start with. When you're talking to an employee and you're having them complete the Form I-9, give them the list of acceptable documents and always make sure that they are the ones who are choosing what to present. That's kind of like the first thing to consider from an unfair or a discrimination type of perspective. We've seen some instances where, for example, an employer just tried to be helpful and they say like, well, these are the two different documents which most of our employees will present, and maybe the individual doesn't have those documents, they have something else, but it's valid, right? So just making sure that you are always giving them that list of acceptable documents. You're not specifying a specific document, and you're also just essentially treating them the same. So that's really kind of the mantra with I-9. You never want to treat somebody differently based on their protected class. And so that would be citizenship status, national origin, or immigration status. And so that's really, and that can be tough because all of a sudden now you've got these immigration policy changes, and you might be thinking, well, gee, I need to go and look at all of my I-9s and try to suss out who's from what country and what type of document. And on the other hand, I got this thing telling me, well, I can't treat anybody differently. So it really is a delicate balancing act.
It is. Yeah, I've seen in a self audit in the past, where someone tried to, just cover all their bases. And so that somebody must have brought in multiple forms of documentation. They're like,
Right.
I'll just include all of them in the
Yes.
document to be safe,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And what's interesting about that, because we see that all the time, is that the Department of Justice came out and said that type of behavior, like asking, even if you're not doing it with any kind of animus or malice in mind, is still a textbook definition of discrimination because you're treating somebody differently based upon their protected class. And so, yeah, it's really tough, but because I know a lot of really just HR people are just trying to be helpful, and they just say, well, more's better, but not necessarily with I-9s.
So, what advice do you have for HR professionals proactively processing and managing I-9 documentation?
Yeah, so I think, we've talked about some of this already, but I think certainly just making sure that you treat the I-9 as a potential risk, right? And then you elevate it even within your organization. There are a lot of different elements associated with that. Obviously, there's audit risk, there's discrimination risk, and obviously, we feel at least the audit risk in particular has been growing. And so, what we always recommend is just that making sure that the entire organization understands that the Form I-9 is it's not just another form of paperwork. It is actually a legal obligation. It has a lot of associated risks with it. And so, once you kind of have that little baseline, then it's all about putting in processes and procedures really to make sure that you are not only keeping up to date with all the different changes in this area, but then also that you have a practice in place to complete it properly, right? And so, as part of that, we always recommend training. So, training is really integral to the Form I-9, right? Because you just, even if you've done this so many times, there's something you can always learn about this process. So we recommend always at least maybe a couple times a year, you just whoever is completing the Form I-9 process that they go through some sort of formal training.
Yeah, great idea. What about requirements and best practices for the virtual I-9 option?
Yeah. So with virtual, it's really first and foremost understanding, really what's involved. So the virtual requires you to have this live video interaction, right? And so employers have to understand how that's going to be set up. What are the mechanics of it? How are they actually going to do that? They need to understand that during that live video interaction, they not only need to see the individual, they need to see the real document. That's one of the common mistakes that we see is people will start doing this process, and then meanwhile they just have it on their phone or something like that. It needs to be an actual document that somebody's holding during this video interaction, making sure that you have that whole scheduling aspect kind of buttoned up and understand how that works. There are other requirements such as having copies of both sides of all the documents. That's generally new for virtual. And then I think in addition to that, just really from an executive level, when are we going to do it? Are we going to do it? Are we going to offer it for all employees? Are we only going to do it for remote employees? Those are other things that I think employers should consider with virtual.
Yeah, really, really great points. All right. So, just a couple more questions for you. SHRM's report on foreign born workers also notes that the US population continues to age, and immigration is discussed as a key tool for meeting labor demand. So, how do you expect the immigration policy and enforcement landscape to change over the next couple of years? And what can HR professionals do to best prepare?
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly has been very dynamic so far. We've only been 6 months into the current administration. There's been so many changes to immigration. We would fully expect that there will be additional changes as well. And I think really from an HR perspective, you have to just look at this from as broad a perspective as possible. This is not only going to impact your I-9s, it might impact your sponsorship of individuals, right? So you might have jobs or occupations that you have traditionally needed to fulfill with foreign talent. You'll need to look at that because we obviously expect to see some tightening of immigration controls and processes. We saw this during the Trump's first administration. We would certainly expect to see the same. So far, like some of the business immigration elements like H-1Bs and others haven't essentially been touched too much yet, but we would expect to see potential. There could also be changes or restrictions relating to certain types of documentation. One of the things that we often talk about is an EAD, which is an employment authorization document. Right now, there's a provision that allows people, many of them, to essentially continue working for a period up to 540 days when they're extending. That has already come under attack. So we have to look to see whether that policy is going to be changing. There's a lot of different things. So I think, again, from an HR kind of like preparedness perspective, it's recognizing that and then just trying to keep up to date with all of these things.
Any final pieces of advice for HR professionals in this area?
It's just, it's always changing. And so I definitely, I highly recommend that individuals, really try to, subscribe to a blog, attend, go to webinars relating to this topic. It seems we like to joke the saying like, well, this is the rule as of today because, it's just constantly changing. And so I think it's really important to keep up to date. And then again, we've talked about it before, but I just think, doing these like kind of self audits, self reviews, extremely important, and then making sure that you have training throughout your processes.
Great. So self audits, training, having great resources at your fingertips is the best approach.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Honest HR. A big thank you to you, John, for sharing your insights with us.
Hello, friends. We hope this week's episode gave you the candid tips and insights you need to keep growing and thriving in your career. Honest HR is part of HR Daily, the content series from SHRM that delivers a daily newsletter directly to your inbox, filled with all the latest HR news and research. Sign up at shrm.org/HR Daily. Plus, follow SHRM on social media for even more clips and stories. Like, share, and add to the comments. Because real change starts with real talk.
Unlock 20% off SHRM educational programs this summer of learning. Use code SUMMER25 and take off in your HR career. Learn more at shrm.org/summer25. Offer ends September 1st.
SHRM.
This podcast is approved for zero 0.5 professional development credits, aka PDCs, toward SHRM CP and SHRM SCP recertification. Enter the following PDC activity ID in your SHRM activity portal to log your credit. 26-2MWEQ. That's 26-2MWEQ. This ID expires on September 1st, 2026.